The Mogollon Rim stretched before them like the jagged spine of some primordial beast, its limestone cliffs carved by millennia into formations that seemed to mock human ambition. February winds screamed through the pine forests below, carrying the promise of another storm that could entomb them as surely as any bullet. Elise Whitlow pressed herself against the rock face, her cream-colored Sunday dress already torn in 3 places fabric that had once represented respectability, now marking her as prey in this wilderness. At 28, she had buried one husband and might not live to see their daughter again. The thought of 18-month-old Rose, hidden away by Pike's machinations in some distant ranch house, sent waves of maternal fury through her exhausted frame. Her thin leather boots, designed for Philadelphia's cobblestones rather than mountain trails, had begun to separate at the seams, admitting moisture that could mean frostbite before dawn. Beside her, Hakan moved with the fluid precision of a man who had learned to read death in every shadow. At 38, the Chiricahua Apache carried his years like accumulated wisdom. Each line in his weathered face spoke of choices made when survival demanded sacrificing one's conscience. The bullet graze on his left thigh had crusted over, but dark stains marked his torn buckskin leggings like a map of their desperate flight. In his calloused hands, he clutched an oilskin packet containing their sole hope, a ledger page proving Thaddeus Pike had murdered Jack Whitlow for a silver vein worth more than most men would earn in 10 lifetimes. Against the weight of their pursuers' determination, the paper felt insubstantial as morning mist. Below them, the Black Fork River ran like polished obsidian through the canyon, its frozen surface appearing solid enough to bear a man's weight, if appearances could be trusted in country where illusion and reality often traded places without warning. The crack of Spencer carbines echoed off canyon walls as 3 riders wearing red scarves spread along the opposite rim, their breath-forming clouds in the bitter air as they searched for movement among the rocks. "There she is." The shout carried clearly in the thin mountain air, followed immediately by bullets chipping stone inches from Elise's head. Sharp limestone fragments drew blood from her cheek, the crimson freezing almost instantly in the wind. Hakan's hands worked with practiced efficiency, fashioning a hasty harness from rope around both their waists. His dark eyes met hers for an instant, and she glimpsed something that might have been regret, not for the choices that had brought them to this precipice, but for the innocence she was losing with each passing hour. "The mountain decides who lives," he said quietly, pressing a worn bandana into her hands. The fabric smelled of sage smoke and old leather. "Breathe through this. It warms the air, keeps your lungs from burning." 3 months ago, in the collapsed tunnel of the Ash River mine, Jack Whitlow had gripped his hand with the desperate strength of a dying man, trading his life for time. "She's all the good I managed in this world." Jack had gasped, blood frothing at his lips as tons of accidentally weakened timber crushed his chest. "Promise me, Hakan. Don't let Pike win." And Hakan had promised, because in 2 years of working as a scout for various mining operations, Jack Whitlow had been the only white man who looked him in the eye when they spoke, who never asked him to betray his people for gold. When bandits had attacked Jack's supply wagon the previous summer, Hakan had tracked them for 3 days through country that would have broken lesser men, returning not just Jack's gold, but his dignity intact. Now that promise burned in his chest like a coal from a sacred fire, the one clean thing in a territory where law bent like grass before the wind of corruption. More bullets sparked off the rocks as they began their descent, sliding down the ice-glazed slope while death whistled overhead. Hakan's old Colt Navy revolver took a direct hit and tumbled into the abyss, but he barely noticed its loss. Behind them, Elise tore her dress hem-free from a jagged outcropping, her movements becoming more decisive with each obstacle overcome. The wind carried their scent away from the shooters above, but it also carried the sound of their breathing, the scrape of leather against stone, the whispered prayers neither would admit to speaking. Hakan's left leg, injured years ago, during a scouting mission gone wrong, sent spikes of agony through his hip with each jarring impact. But Jack's dying words drove him forward through the pain. As they reached the canyon floor, pursuit sounds grew fainter. Boyle's men would need time to find another way down, precious minutes, that might mean the difference between capture and escape. But in wilderness, like this time, was measured in heartbeats, and each one brought them closer to the moment when cold or exhaustion would succeed where bullets had failed. The shallow cave they found beneath a limestone overhang offered blessed protection from wind that cut through clothing like a blade. As the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, erasing their tracks, while bringing the promise of a storm that could kill them as surely as any human enemy, Hakan began building a fire that would provide warmth without betraying their location. In the gathering darkness, with death closing from all directions, they remained alive. It wasn't much, but it was enough to honor the promise that had brought them this far enough to keep faith with a dead man's final wish and a living woman's desperate hope. The cave smelled of ancient stone and forgotten seasons, its walls bearing scratches left by generations of creatures seeking shelter from the mountain's harsh embrace. Hakan worked with methodical precision, arranging tinder and kindling with movements that seemed almost ceremonial in their careful deliberation. Each spark struck from flint and steel represented hope nursed from desperation. His remaining supplies could be inventoried in heartbeats, a skinning knife, with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use, 2 cartridges for a borrowed Winchester that might fire true when the moment came, and the oilskin packet that had already cost one man his life. Everything else, food, ammunition, easy escape, had been stripped away by circumstance and relentless pursuit. The ledger troubles you, Elise observed, watching him heat a flat stone in the smokeless fire. Despite exhaustion, her voice retained the cultured cadences of Philadelphia society, though months on the frontier had given it an edge that would have shocked her finishing school instructors. You read it like a death warrant. She had grown up in her father's banking house, learning to evaluate risk and character from men who believed women incapable of understanding such complexities. Coming west had been her only option after her father's death left debts exceeding his estate's value. The mail-order marriage to Jack Whitlow had somehow blossomed into genuine affection, and then love, a transformation that had surprised them both. Hakan placed the heated stone against her feet, and she gasped as warmth penetrated the thin leather of her church boots. "Death warrant for Pike," he said simply. "If we reach Silver City. When we reach Silver City." She corrected, noting how his eyes tracked shadows at the cave mouth. "Jack always said you were the most reliable man in the territory. I'm beginning to understand why." The single page looked innocuous enough when unwrapped, lined paper with neat handwriting that might have documented anything from supply orders to personal correspondence. But the words it contained were a death warrant signed in Pike's own hand. Work Order Section 7, Support Modification. Hakan read slowly, his finger tracing letters that had been purchased with blood. His English was functional rather than fluent, learned during years working with settlers who needed guides through Apache territory. Weaken primary beam per specifications. Payment on completion, T. Pike. Pike's signature sprawled across the bottom like a declaration of ownership, as if taking Jack Whitlow's life had been merely another business transaction to be filed with receipts for mining equipment and payroll records. The implications reached beyond simple murder. This proved a conspiracy extending into territorial government itself. He controls everything in Ash River. Elise continued accepting jerky from Hakan's meager supply. The dried meat was tough as leather, but provided necessary protein. The bank assay office, half the businesses on Main Street. When Jack died, Pike claimed the mine under territorial salvage law. Said there were no valid heirs, no legal impediment to his claim. The fire crackled softly between them, casting dancing shadows on cave walls, while outside the wind drove snow through the entrance in swirling eddies. Hakan ate sparingly, knowing their supplies wouldn't last another day without careful rationing. Hunger was a familiar companion. He had learned to ignore its demands during lean times following his father's death and his own exile from the reservation. But marriage makes you Jack's heir. He said, understanding the broader implications, even while struggling with legal terminology. Witnessed by Isaac Boone and Eddie Shaw, recorded in Tucson the day after our ceremony. Her voice carried the precision of someone who had learned that details could mean the difference between justice and catastrophe. Pike knows it. That's why he's desperate to prevent us from reaching Judge Warfield. My legal claim to the mine threatens everything he's built. As she spoke, memory surfaced unbidden. Jack returning that final evening with excitement in his eyes, talking about the pure silver vein he'd discovered in what everyone considered a played-out claim. He had been planning to register the discovery officially, to follow every legal requirement, so ownership couldn't be questioned. Instead, he had shared his news with Pike, trusting the business relationship they had maintained for 2 years. Pike's assay office had tested samples from dozens of Jack's smaller claims, always dealing fairly. There had been no reason to suspect that success would transform a reliable partner into a murderer. Pike couldn't simply steal it. Hakan observed understanding dawning in his voice. Too many people knew about the marriage, Jack's legal claim. So he decided to eliminate both of you, make it appear accidental. The calculation was coldly logical. Jack dies in a mining accident. Elise succumbs to grief or exposure. While fleeing imaginary dangers, their infant daughter disappears into territorial orphanages. With no heirs to contest his claim, Pike could register the silver vein in his name and become one of the wealthiest men west of the Mississippi. What Pike hadn't anticipated was Jack's foresight in copying the incriminating work order or Hakan's refusal to let his friend's death go unavenged. The promise made in that collapsed tunnel had become more than obligation, and it was the thread holding together what remained of Hakan's faith in justice's possibility. We reach Silver City, he said with quiet certainty. Judge Warfield sees this evidence. Pike answers for what he's done. Outside, the storm was building toward the kind of ferocity that could reshape landscapes, burying landmarks, and creating new channels for spring floods. But for now, in this small pool of warmth and light, they were safe. The fire would burn for hours, if carefully tended, and their pursuers would need time to organize a systematic search of the canyon's many hiding places. Hakan fed another stick to the flames and began planning their next move, his mind working through possibilities, while the woman beside him dozed against the stone wall. The image that would remain with him later was this: the two of them side by side in firelight, united in determination to see justice done, the vast darkness beyond their small circle, holding both danger and promise in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, new dangers, and the continuing test of whether two people armed with nothing but courage and truth could prevail against an enemy who controlled lawland and the loyalty of desperate men. But tonight, they were alive, and the promise remained unbroken. Dawn broke gray and reluctant over the Mogollon Rim, and the sky the color of old pewter as storm clouds gathered strength for another assault on the high country. The air carried the metallic taste of approaching snow, and the subtle wrongness that preceded violent weather, a stillness that made even the wind seem to hold its breath in anticipation. Elise woke to find Hakan already moving his weathered hands, checking their meager supplies, while his eyes scanned the canyon rim for movement. The fire had burned to glowing coals during the night, providing just enough warmth to prevent hypothermia, but not enough to eliminate the bone-deep chill that came from sleeping on stone in February. "They move at first light," he said quietly, helping her to her feet. Her muscles had stiffened during the night, and the first steps sent sharp pains through her legs. The thin leather of her church boots showed new cracks, where cold had made the material brittle, and she could feel moisture seeping through to her stockings. The Black Fork River lay before them like a test of faith, its surface glazed with ice that appeared solid enough to support their weight, if appearances could be trusted in country where illusion and reality often exchange places without warning. Hakan knelt at the water's edge, testing the frozen surface with his knife pommel, while Elise watched the canyon rim for movement. "It holds," he pronounced, though something in his tone suggested caution rather than confidence. "But we cross fast, stay together. Ice this thin breaks without warning." That was when Boyle's men appeared, emerging from the tree line, like wolves who had spent the night tracking scent through darkness. 7 riders spread in a formation that spoke of military training or long experience hunting human prey. Their red scarves had become as recognizable in the territory as a rattlesnake's warning Pike's private army men, who had learned that loyalty to the right employer could prove more profitable than adherence to territorial law. Their Spencer carbines caught weak morning light steel and brass, gleaming with the promise of swift, certain death. Boyle himself sat his horse in the center, a man in his early 40s, who had discovered that violence could be lucrative if applied with sufficient intelligence and discretion. His face bore scars from years of settling disputes with fists and knives, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who treated killing as business. "Mrs. Whitlow." His voice carried clearly across the frozen river, echoing off canyon walls with false cordiality. "You're making this considerably more difficult than necessary. Mr. Pike simply wishes to discuss your situation, perhaps reach an arrangement beneficial to all parties involved." Hakan was already moving, pushing Elise toward a fallen spruce that provided the only cover on their side of the river. The massive trunk had been felled by some long-ago storm, its branches now bare and brittle with cold, but it offered concealment from rifles trained on them from across the water. "Remain low," he whispered, checking his Winchester's action. 2 cartridges that represented their total firepower against 7 men, armed with military-grade weapons and absolute certainty that failure meant death or worse. "Jack is dead because of your Mr. Pike." Elise called back, her voice carrying strength that surprised them both. 3 months of grief and fear had burned away much of her eastern gentility, leaving something harder and more resilient. "I have nothing to discuss with a man who orchestrates murder for profit." Boyle's laugh was harsh as breaking glass, devoid of genuine humor. "Jack Whitlow died because he grew careless around heavy machinery, madam. Accidents occur regularly in the mining business. Ask anyone who's worked underground for more than a season. Like the accident that strategically weakened the support beam in Section 7. Elise shot back, her words carrying across the water with deadly precision. "The one documented in your employer's own handwriting." The silence that followed was more damning than any confession. Hakan saw the change in Boyle's expression, the way the foreman's hand tightened on his rifle stock, as he realized their quarry possessed knowledge that could destroy everything Pike had constructed. The charade of legal discussion was finished. Now it was simply a matter of silencing witnesses before they could reach someone with authority to act. "Eliminate the Apache," Boyle said quietly to his men, but his words carried clearly in the thin air. "Bring me the woman breathing. Pike requires her signature on certain documents before she experiences her own unfortunate accident." The first shot splintered the log above their heads, sending bark and wood fragments spinning through the air like deadly confetti. Hakan rolled left, putting distance between himself and Elise, drawing the shooter's attention, while calculating angles and possibilities with desperate precision. He aimed carefully and fired once, not attempting to kill. The range was too great for certainty, but to force the riders to seek cover instead of advancing. The bullet sparked off rocks near Boyle's horse, causing the animal to rear and spoiling the foreman's aim for precious seconds. "Move!" Hakan shouted to Elise, watching her drop to her belly and begin crawling toward the river, while bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. "Stay flat, distribute your weight across the surface." He fired his second and final cartridge, then drew his knife and began following her across the treacherous ice, using the rope connecting them as both lifeline and guide. The frozen surface groaned ominously under their combined weight, a sound like the earth itself protesting this violation of natural law. Behind them, Boyle's men had reached the riverbank and were taking more careful aim now that distance had closed. A bullet struck the ice just ahead of them, and suddenly water was welling through the crack, black and cold as liquid death. The shock of it penetrating Elise's dress sent her into convulsive shivering. But she maintained her forward movement with grim determination. They were 3/4 across when the ice began its final surrender to physics and accumulated stress. The crack that had started with the bullet impact spread outward like a spider web, each new fracture accompanied by sounds that seemed to emanate from the earth's bones. "Run!" Hakan shouted, lunging to his feet and hauling Elise up beside him as the frozen surface tilted and shifted beneath their boots. They covered the final 20 yards in a desperate sprint while the river reclaimed its surface behind them. Great chunks of ice tilting and sliding as the current swept them downstream. A bullet from Boyle's rifle caught Hakan in the upper right arm, and the impact spinning him half around, but he maintained his grip on the rope and pulled Elise up the far bank as the last ice collapsed into churning black water that would have meant instant death for anyone unlucky enough to fall through. Their pack mule, which had been following at cautious distance, panicked at the sound of gunfire and breaking ice. It bolted downstream, taking their remaining food supplies and any hope of reaching Silver City on anything other than foot-through country that could kill the unwary in countless ways. Hakan pressed his hand against the bullet wound in his arm, feeling warm blood flow that meant the projectile had torn muscle as well as flesh. Elise's dress was soaked from the waist down, the wet fabric already beginning to freeze in the morning air. Without immediate shelter and fire to restore their core temperature, hypothermia would claim them both within hours. But they were alive, and they still possessed the ledger page proving Pike's guilt. Boyle's men would find another way across the river, but that would require time they could use to put distance between themselves and their pursuers, time to find shelter and tend wounds, time to keep the promise alive for another day. As they stumbled away from the riverbank, leaving bloody footprints in the snow, the first fat flakes of the approaching storm began to fall, each one a small blessing that would help conceal their trail, and a small curse that brought them closer to the kind of cold that stopped hearts and froze breath in the lungs. The line shack materialized through swirling snow, like salvation granted to the desperate 4 walls of rough-hewn logs beneath a cedar-shake roof that had weathered decades of mountain storms. It sat in a small clearing perhaps 50 yards off the abandoned Pinedale Trail, maintained by the unspoken code of frontier hospitality that recognized shelter might someday mean survival for any traveler. But they weren't the only creatures seeking refuge from winter's bite. Wolf tracks in the snow around the cabin told a story of hunger and patience that chilled Hakan's blood. The prints were massive, easily the size of a man's hand, and numerous enough to suggest a pack of at least 6 animals driven down from high country by the unusually harsh winter. Wolves rarely attacked humans under normal circumstances, but these weren't normal circumstances, and the scent of blood from his wounded arm marked them as potentially vulnerable prey. "How many do you count?" Elise whispered, her lips showing the blue tinge that meant her body was losing its battle against hypothermia. Her soaked dress had begun to freeze in the wind, the fabric crackling when she moved, and her thin boots squelched with each step as melted snow penetrated the failing leather. 7, maybe 8. Hakan replied, though he could distinguish at least 9 separate sets of tracks circling the cabin in patterns suggesting reconnaissance rather than casual passage. He still carried his rifle, but without ammunition, it was little more than an expensive club. Whatever they found inside the shack would have to suffice for both defense and survival. The cabin door was secured with a simple wooden latch frontier. Hospitality assumed anyone desperate enough to break into a line shack probably needed whatever they found more than the absent owner. The single room contained usual emergency supplies, several cans of beans and peaches, a small bag of coffee hardtack biscuits that would break teeth unless properly soaked, and a modest supply of split firewood stacked beside a stone hearth that looked like it had warmed desperate travelers for 20 years. More importantly, thorough search revealed a wooden box containing 24 40-40-40 cartridges that would fit his Winchester, not enough for prolonged siege, but sufficient to remind the wolves that humans were dangerous prey. He loaded the rifle, quickly checking action and sights, while Elise stripped out of her frozen dress and wrapped herself in wool blankets that smelled of wood smoke and old tobacco. "You need warmth before anything else," he said, building up the fire with practiced efficiency while heating stones among the coals. Hypothermia was a killer that worked slowly but inexorably, shutting down vital functions as core temperature dropped below sustainable levels. In 1879, without modern medical intervention, people died regularly from cold exposure, their hearts simply stopping when their bodies could no longer maintain basic life processes. The heated stones, wrapped in cloth torn from her petticoat, brought blessed warmth to her feet and hands. He watched color slowly return to her extremities, noting with relief that telltale white patches of frostbite were minor and would likely heal without permanent damage. The pain of returning circulation made her bite her lip to prevent crying out. But pain meant life, meant the possibility of seeing another dawn. "Tell me about your husband's discovery." He said, needing to keep her talking, ensuring she remained conscious and alert while her body recovered from its brush with hypothermia. How did a played-out claim suddenly become valuable? Jack possessed the most stubborn streak imaginable. She replied, her voice growing stronger as warmth spread through her body. He'd been working that claim for 8 months, following a quartz intrusion that kept promising silver, but never delivering more than trace amounts. Any reasonable man would have abandoned it after the first month of fruitless digging. Outside, the wolves had grown bolder as darkness approached. Hakan could see their eyes reflecting firelight through the single window, amber gleams that never seemed to blink, calculating and patient in the way of predators who understood that persistence often succeeded where boldness failed. The pack had probably been following their scent trail since morning, drawn by blood and the desperate exhaustion that marked them as potential victims. But Jack wasn't reasonable about abandoning things he believed in. Elise continued, managing a wan smile at the memory. He claimed the mountain was attempting to communicate with him, that he simply needed to listen carefully enough to understand its message. 3 months ago, he broke through into a pocket of pure silver ore, the kind of discovery that miners dream about but rarely witness. Pike learned of this how. Jack's inherent honesty proved his downfall. Her laugh held more bitterness than humor. He brought samples to Pike's assay office, believing a partnership might prove mutually beneficial. Pike had always dealt fairly with him, previously testing ore samples and providing accurate assessments for reasonable fees. There seemed no reason to suspect that success would transform a reliable business partner into a cold-blooded murderer. The first wolf appeared at the clearing's edge, just as full darkness settled over the mountains, a massive gray male with scarred flanks and yellow eyes that held no trace of the fear that normally kept wild animals away from human habitation. Hakan raised his rifle and fired a warning shot, not aiming to kill, but to establish the dominance that might convince the pack to seek easier prey elsewhere. The wolves scattered at the gunshot, but he knew they would return. Predators this desperate wouldn't be deterred by a single demonstration of human superiority, especially when they could smell weakness and exhaustion on the wind. Working quickly by firelight, he rigged a crude snare using wires salvaged from the cabin's small collection of repair materials. The trap was positioned near the woodpile, where approaching wolves would have to pass a desperate gambit that might buy them precious minutes when the inevitable attack came. It came just after midnight, when the fire had burned down to glowing coals and cold had begun its renewed assault on the cabin's thin walls. The big male approached from the front, while 2 others flanked the building, their movements coordinated with precision that spoke of hunters who had worked together for years. Hakan waited until the lead wolf committed to its charge, then triggered the snare with a sharp jerk on the control line. The wire loop caught the animal around the neck, but the wolf was too strong, too determined. It broke free, after only momentary restraint, then leapt toward the cabin door with jaws agape and murder gleaming in its eyes. Hakan met the attack with his axe, the blade, taking the wolf cleanly between the eyes and dropping it instantly. But the sounds of struggle brought the rest of the pack running, and suddenly the night exploded into snarling chaos as he fought to keep them away from the door where Elise waited with a burning brand from the fire. The battle lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it ended, 2 wolves lay dead in the snow, and the survivors had melted back into the forest to nurse wounds and reconsider their tactical approach. Hakan dragged the carcasses inside, already planning how to use every part of the animal's meat for sustenance, hide for warmth, bones for tools, if circumstances required such desperation. "You cannot continue running with that arm," Elise observed, watching him stitch the bullet wound with an awl and thread from the cabin's supplies. The improvised surgery was crude but effective, and she helped tie off sutures with strips torn from her undergarments. "Don't need to outrun them," Hakan replied, testing range of motion in his injured limb. The stitches pulled tight, but his arm remained functional. "Just need to outlast them. The mountain tests everyone equally." But even as he spoke, they both heard the sound that transformed hope into despair. The distant whinny of horses carrying men through the forest, accompanied by voices calling coordinates and search patterns through the storm. Pike's hunters had found their trail despite the snow, and they were closing in with methodical persistence of professionals who understood that failure was not an option. Working frantically in the firelight, they gathered what supplies they could carry and prepared to abandon their temporary refuge. There was a crawl space beneath the cabin's back wall, barely wide enough for a human body, but leading to the tree line beyond their only escape route now that Boyle's men had discovered their location. As torches appeared between the trees and angry voices filled the clearing they had just vacated, Hakan pushed Elise through the narrow opening and followed her into the night. Behind them, the cabin door crashed open, and rough voices filled the space they had occupied moments before. But they were already moving through the forest, guided by starlight and desperation toward uncertain sanctuary. That was when salvation appeared in the unlikely form of Isaac Boone, stepping out from behind a massive ponderosa pine, with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally chosen his side in a conflict that had torn his conscience apart for too many months. At 45, Isaac carried himself with dignity that came from learning respect must be earned rather than demanded. His graying hair was hidden beneath a worn felt hat, and his clothes spoke of a man who worked with his hands but took pride in his appearance. The flour sack he carried contained supplies gathered specifically for this moment, while the Remington revolver in his belt suggested he was prepared to fight for his convictions. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said quietly, his voice carrying the particular warmth that came from genuine respect. "Ma'am, I served as camp cook for your husband at the mine. Name's Isaac Boone, and I've been waiting for an opportunity to make things right." Elise recognized him immediately. The soft-spoken man who had prepared meals for mining crews who had quit his position the day after Jack's funeral rather than continue working for the man who had murdered his friend. What she didn't realize was that Isaac had been haunting the area for weeks, looking for a chance to strike back against Pike's empire of corruption and violence. "I observed the smoke from your fire." He continued offering them coffee from a battered tin cup that steamed in the frigid air. "Been tracking Pike's men as well, waiting for the proper moment to act. Calculated you might require assistance." The coffee was revelation hot bitter and laced with enough sugar to provide immediate energy to their exhausted bodies. But more than physical relief, Isaac's presence offered something they had almost given up hoping for: proof that not everyone in the territory had succumbed to Pike's influence, that allies still existed for those brave enough to stand against corruption. "There's an abandoned logging road approximately 2 miles north of here," Isaac said, pointing through the trees toward higher ground. "Been unused for 5 years, but it'll take you toward Silver City without passing through any settlements where Pike maintains influence. Road's rough, but it beats attempting to cross open country with those hunters on your trail." It wasn't much a half-forgotten track through wilderness that might or might not still be passable after years of neglect and winter storms. But it represented hope, a chance to reach Judge Warfield before Pike's bribes and threats could poison the well of territorial justice completely. As they prepared to move deeper into the forest, Isaac pressed something into Elise's palm, a small silver cross that had belonged to his mother, carried through slavery and freedom, as a reminder that faith could survive even the darkest circumstances. "For luck," he said simply. But his eyes conveyed a deeper message that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of personal cost, that courage could be found in the most unlikely places, and that even in a territory ruled by violence and greed, decent people would eventually stand and be counted. Ash River crouched in the valley like a predator digesting its latest kill. Its collection of ramshackle buildings, connected by streets frozen into rutted channels of mud and horse dung. Smoke rose from perhaps 20 chimneys, mixing with the perpetual haze that hung over Pike's mining operations, creating an atmosphere that seemed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. The town existed for one purpose: extracting wealth from the earth and concentrating it in hands ruthless enough to seize it. Every business, every official, every supposed pillar of the community owed their prosperity to Thaddeus Pike's goodwill. A fact that made Ash River less a settlement than a company town, where descent was a luxury few could afford. Hakan pulled his hat low over his features and tucked the beaded strip from his headband deep inside his shirt, transforming himself from recognizable Apache scout to just another drifter seeking work in the mines. The eagle feather gifted by his Lakota friend, a token of respect earned during a difficult winter when he had guided a lost cavalry patrol to safety, was carefully hidden in his pack, along with anything else that might mark him as different from the mixed crowd of miners, gamblers, and opportunists who populated such places. Elise had adopted different camouflage, rolling up her sleeves and staining her hands with ash from their morning fire. Her torn and dirty dress now made her appear like any other working woman struggling to survive in a place where feminine delicacy was both impractical and dangerous. The transformation was more than cosmetic. Something fundamental had changed in her during their flight through the wilderness, burning away the last vestiges of Eastern gentility and leaving someone harder and more resilient. Their destination was the telegraph office, a small frame building that housed both Western Union equipment and Eddie Shaw's photographic business. At barely 20, Eddie possessed skills that made him valuable to miners, wanting to send pictures home to their families, as well as the discretion necessary to survive in a town where asking wrong questions could prove fatal. The young operator looked nervous as Elise approached his window, his hands trembling slightly, as he recognized the woman Pike's men had been hunting throughout the territory. "Ma'am," he said carefully, glancing around to ensure they weren't being observed. "I heard that is Mr. Pike has been saying certain things." "Mr. Pike says many things, most of which bear little relationship to truth." Elise replied with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to evaluating men's character through their statements rather than their reputations. "I require you to photograph this document and create a glass negative plate. I can compensate you $20 for the service." $20 represented more money than Eddie typically earned in a month, but the sum only seemed to increase his nervousness. Pike's influence extended into every corner of Ash River, and crossing the mine owner could mean exile from the only community Eddie had ever known, or worse. "Ma'am, if Mr. Pike discovers I assisted you," he began, but Hakan's quiet voice from the doorway interrupted him. "If you don't help her, Pike will never have to worry about discovering anything," the Apache scout said without threat or menace, simply stating a fact all three understood. They were already dead if the truth didn't reach Silver City, which meant usual calculations of risk and reward no longer applied. Eddie looked from one to the other, seeing something in their faces that convinced him more effectively than any bribe or threat. "Bring it to the back room," he said finally. "I maintain a heated chamber where the chemicals won't freeze during winter months." While Eddie worked with his camera and developing solutions, Hakan made his way through the town's back alleys to gather intelligence on Pike's forces and intentions. The mining office dominated Ash River's main street, a substantial building of quarried stone designed to project permanence and respectability in a settlement where both qualities were rare commodities. Through frost-glazed windows, he could see Pike himself holding court in his private office, a man in his mid-40s, whose soft hands and expensive clothes proclaimed his distance from the dangerous work that funded his prosperity. Pike's face bore the particular smugness of someone who had never doubted his own superiority, never questioned his right to take whatever he desired from those too weak to resist. But it was the conversation Hakan overheard in the stable yard that sent ice through his veins, confirming their worst fears about the depth of Pike's corruption. Judge Warfield has been influenced through Tuesday. Boyle was explaining to another man, his voice carrying the confidence of someone discussing routine business. Cost considerably more than anticipated, but Pike considers it a worthwhile investment. After Tuesday, all bets are off. Warfield has too much reputation to risk for any amount of money. What about the woman and her Indian? Pike wants the woman breathing long enough to sign certain transfer documents, make everything appear legally proper before she experiences her own unfortunate accident. Boyle spat into the frozen mud with casual contempt. The Apache, though? Eliminate him immediately. He possesses nothing we require, and Pike wishes to send a clear message about what happens to people who interfere in his business interests. 5 men currently in town, 2 more stationed on roads leading to Silver City. Pike was taking no chances with witnesses who might undermine his carefully constructed empire. But Tuesday was still 3 days away, and Judge Warfield had built his career on a reputation for integrity that Pike's money might not be able to purchase permanently. The sound of raised voices from the Silver Dollar Saloon drew Hakan's attention, and through the establishment's grimy windows, he could see a crowd gathered around 2 men engaged in heated argument. One wore the red scarf marking him as Pike's employee, while the other appeared to be a prospector, whose claim to disputed ground was being challenged through legal maneuvers that had nothing to do with justice. That was when their careful plan dissolved into chaos. The man at the bar turned at the wrong moment, and his eyes locked with Hakan's through the window. Recognition flared between them, and this was Crenshaw, one of Boyle's lieutenants present during the river crossing. For a frozen heartbeat, neither man moved, each calculating distances and possibilities. Then Crenshaw was reaching for his gun, and all pretense of stealth evaporated. Hakan crashed through the saloon's batwing doors as the first shot splintered the frame where his head had been seconds before. The crowded room erupted in chaos, miners and gamblers diving for cover as gunfire echoed off the walls like thunder trapped in a bottle. Hakan grabbed a chair and swung it at Crenshaw's gun hand, sending the weapon spinning across the sawdust-covered floor. The fight was brief, but vicious, 2 men grappling with desperate intensity of opponents who understood that defeat meant death. Crenshaw was younger and uninjured, but Hakan possessed the wiry strength of someone who had learned to survive through wit and endurance rather than brute force. A broken bottle opened a gash across Crenshaw's forehead, temporarily blinding him with blood. While an overturned table provided momentary cover, Hakan needed to reach the back door. He ran through the alley behind the saloon, knowing every second counted now that their presence had been discovered. At the telegraph office, he found Elise carefully wrapping the precious glass negative plate in cloth, while Eddie watched with obvious terror. "We must leave immediately," Hakan said simply, and the urgency in his voice eliminated any need for detailed explanation. They made it to the railroad tracks before Pike's men could organize effective pursuit, commandeering a handcar that had been abandoned by a maintenance crew. The small platform moved slowly, at first requiring both of them to work the pump handle, but gained speed as they reached the downhill grade leading toward canyon country. Behind them, 5 riders pushed their horses hard to keep pace with the handcar, their Spencer carbines cracking as they tried to disable their quarry without destroying the evidence Pike needed to complete his legal fiction. Bullets sparked off steel rails, and one gunman managed to leap from his horse onto the moving platform before Hakan clubbed him senseless with a track maintenance crowbar. At the trestle crossing over Willow Creek, they abandoned the handcar in a calculated gambit, jumping off and letting the empty platform continue down the track while they scrambled down the embankment. The pursuing riders thundered across the wooden bridge, following their decoy into the distance, while Hakan and Elise worked their way back toward town through the creek bottom. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. When they returned to the telegraph office to send their message to Judge Warfield, they found the communication lines had been severed. Eddie stood in the doorway with guilt and terror warring across his young features, his hands shaking as he explained what had transpired in their absence. "They forced me to cut the wires," he whispered, tears freezing on his cheeks in the bitter air. "Boyle threatened to burn the office with me inside if I transmitted any messages without Pike's explicit approval. I apologize, I wanted to help, but I have a younger sister in Denver who depends on the money I send her each month." Pike's control over Ash River was absolute, extending into every corner of daily life with the thoroughness of a spider's web. Every potential ally was compromised by fear or financial dependence. Every escape route blocked by men who understood their own survival depended on ensuring no witnesses reached the outside world. They were trapped in hostile territory with evidence that could topple the most powerful man in the region, but no way to communicate that evidence to anyone with authority to act upon it. And somewhere in the gathering darkness beyond the town limits, 7 armed men were converging on their location with orders that left no room for mercy or negotiation. The mining office stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, its stone walls holding secrets that had already purchased one man's death and might yet claim 2 more lives before sunrise. While Pike's hunters scoured the countryside in increasingly desperate search, Hakan and Elise made their final gambit penetrate the heart of Pike's operation and find evidence that might strengthen their case beyond any possibility of legal challenge. The lock on Pike's private office was substantial, a carpenter mechanism shipped from Chicago at considerable expense. But Hakan's skinning knife proved adequate as a pry bar when applied with sufficient leverage and determination. The door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the building like a gunshot. But no alarm sounded, no guards came running to investigate the intrusion. Inside the office reflected Pike's pretensions to respectability and his hunger for social acceptance that money could buy, but character could not earn. Leather-bound ledgers lined mahogany shelves, while oil paintings of various Eastern politicians, men who had probably never ventured west of the Mississippi, gazed down with benevolent smugness of those who profited from territorial exploitation without witnessing its human cost. The safe dominated one corner like a steel monument to paranoia, its Mosler construction representing the finest in bank-grade security available in 1879. But Elise knew the combination Jack had mentioned, watching Pike open it during one of their business meetings, never imagining that his casual observation would someday mean the difference between justice and unmarked graves. The contents exceeded their expectations and shattered their understanding of Pike's methods in equal measure. The marriage addendum sat atop other documents. Like an accusation, its legal language precise and damning. Dated 3 days before the mine collapse, it showed Jack Whitlow selling his claim to Pike for a loan of $500 a sum, representing perhaps 1/1000th of the silver vein's actual value. The document appeared authentic, complete with proper witnesses and notarization, legal proof that Pike had obtained legitimate ownership of the richest mineral strike in territorial history. But beneath the addendum, sealed in an envelope marked with Jack's careful handwriting, lay evidence that transformed their understanding of the entire conspiracy. "My dearest Elise," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my fears have proven justified, and Pike has acted against me as I suspected he might. I pray that Hakan has kept his word and delivered you safely to someone who can act on what I have discovered." Inside the envelope was a duplicate of the work order they already carried. But this copy bore additional notations in Jack's own hand, detailed explanations of Pike's plan and timeline, along with observations about the broader conspiracy that reached into territorial legislature and beyond. More damning still was Pike's signet ring, the heavy gold band smeared with what could only be Jack's blood, taken during a struggle that had preceded the accidental cave-in by several hours. Pike came to see me the night before the collapse, Jack had written. He wanted me to sign over the mine, voluntarily claimed it was for my own protection against claim jumpers and territorial politics. When I refused, he had Boyle and another man restrain me while he forced the pen into my hand. I managed to grab his ring during the struggle, physical evidence of what really happened. The marriage addendum is genuine, but it was signed under duress after Pike threatened to harm you and Rose if I didn't cooperate. But the revelation that struck Hakan like a physical blow lay wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of Boyle's desk drawer, a bone-handled knife that he recognized with the terrible certainty of blood kinship. The weapon had belonged to his younger brother Nantan, distinguished by a distinctive lightning bolt carved near the guard. Hakan had made that mark himself during a coming-of-age ceremony 15 years ago, when Nantan had earned his first adult name and the right to carry weapons in defense of their people. The blade was stained with old blood, and attached to the handle was a small leather pouch containing gold dust that told its own story of violence and theft. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Hakan's hands shook as he held the knife, memories flooding back with overwhelming force. Nantan laughing as they practiced with their first bows. Nantan following him into the white man's world, believing his older brother knew the path to acceptance and prosperity. Nantan's woman Morning Star, still waiting on the reservation for a man who would never return. Your brother? Elise whispered, understanding immediately. Pike killed your brother too. Nantan had died 6 months earlier in what Pike's men claimed was a mining accident, crushed in a shaft collapse, while working a claim that bordered Pike's expanding territory. The family had been told it was simply misfortune, another casualty of the dangerous work that claimed so many lives in the mining districts. But the knife revealed the truth. Nantan had died fighting, killed by Pike's men in a dispute over mineral rights that threatened to expose the broader pattern of murder and claim jumping that funded Pike's empire. 2 brothers. Hakan said, his voice barely above a whisper, as understanding flooded through him like ice water. Jack and Nantan, both killed for standing in Pike's way. Both died believing justice existed in this territory. The personal nature of his quest crystallized in that moment. This wasn't simply about honoring Jack Whitlow's dying wish. It was about justice for his own brother, vengeance for a family torn apart by Pike's methodical greed, redemption for his failure to protect someone who had looked to him for guidance and wisdom. The bone-handled knife seemed to pulse with significance in his calloused hands, a tangible connection to the brother whose death he had accepted too easily, whose memory deserved better than the convenient lies that had buried truth along with his body. Nantan had been planning to marry Morning Star, had been saving money to buy her the kind of white woman's dress that would make their wedding ceremony special in both worlds. Now she would wait forever for a man who had died, believing his older brother would avenge any injustice done to their family. As they prepared to leave the office with their expanded collection of evidence, footsteps echoed in the street outside, accompanied by the metallic click of a shotgun being cocked with professional competence. Deputy Miriam Collins appeared in the doorway, her weapon leveled at Hakan's chest, her face set in grim lines of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. Step away from the desk, she ordered, her voice carrying the authority of territorial law enforcement. You're under arrest for the murder of Prospector William Hayes. It was fabrication, of course, another of Pike's convenient lies, designed to provide legal cover for what would otherwise be simple murder. But Miriam Collins had been walking a delicate line for years, trying to maintain some vestige of actual law enforcement in a town completely dominated by Pike's influence and financial power. At 34, she had learned that survival in her position required choosing battles, carefully accepting small compromises to prevent larger injustices, and building cases slowly against opponents who controlled most traditional sources of evidence and testimony. She possessed intelligence, integrity, and courage in roughly equal measure, but had lacked the smoking gun necessary to challenge Pike's empire directly. Now that smoking gun lay spread across Pike's own desk in the form of documents and physical evidence that even the most corrupt judge would find difficult to ignore. "This is what you've been seeking," Elise said, holding up the envelope and its contents with steady hands, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to presenting complex arguments to skeptical audiences. "Comprehensive proof that Pike murdered my husband and this man's brother. Documentation that he's been corrupting territorial officials and subverting the legal system for personal profit. Evidence that his crimes extend far beyond what anyone previously suspected." Miriam's eyes fixed on Pike's blood-stained ring on the forged marriage documents, on the bone-handled knife that spoke of violence and cover-ups spanning months of carefully planned murders. For years, she had suspected Pike's involvement in the territory's epidemic of mining accidents and claim disputes, but had lacked concrete evidence necessary to build a case that would survive legal challenge. The evidence before her now was overwhelming, a paper trail leading directly to Pike and his network of hired killers, supported by physical proof that no amount of bribery or intimidation could explain away. But acting on it would require courage that went beyond personal risk, would demand a leap of faith that the territorial justice system still contained enough integrity to function when properly motivated. "I'm taking you both into protective custody," she said finally, lowering her shotgun, but maintaining her official demeanor. "Pike has men watching every road out of town, but my jail has thick walls and a back entrance that most people don't know exists. We hold until Judge Warfield returns from Santa Fe, then present this evidence through proper legal channels." But even as she spoke, they could hear commotion in the street outside, shouts, running feet, the sound of men organizing for action. Through the office window, they could see orange glow of flames reflected off clouds, accompanied by the acrid smell of smoke that spoke of buildings burning rather than hearth fires warming homes. Pike was making his final move, and time was running out for all of them. The blizzard descended upon Ash River with the violence of divine retribution, transforming the struggling mining town into a frozen battlefield, where visibility dropped to mere yards and wind howled like voices of the damned. Snow, driven by gusts that could knock a man off his feet, turned the air solid white while temperatures plummeted to levels that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. It was perfect cover for Pike's apocalyptic gambit. The fire had started at the assay office, flames licking hungrily at the wooden structure that housed decades of mining records, claim documents, and paperwork, proving Pike's systematic fraud against dozens of smaller operators. The building went up like a torch, sending burning embers spinning through the air to land on nearby roofs, while Pike's men used the chaos to position themselves for a final assault on the jail where their quarry had taken refuge. From the narrow window of Miriam's office, they watched flames spread with methodical precision of arson rather than accident. Already the general store was catching fire, and sparks showered down on the livery stable where nearly 24 horses were beginning to panic at the smell of smoke. "He's incinerating the entire town," Miriam observed grimly, checking her ammunition supply with practiced movements of someone who had learned to count bullets in moments of crisis, simply to eliminate any witnesses who might testify against him. The calculation was coldly logical in its simplicity: destroy all records that might contradict Pike's version of events, eliminate people who possessed inconvenient knowledge, and emerge from the ashes as the sole authority capable of rebuilding Ash River according to his vision of profitable order. The cost in property and human life was simply the price of conducting business in a territory where legal niceties often yielded to practical necessities. That was when Isaac Boone appeared at the jail's rear entrance like salvation. Given human form, his face illuminated by the hellish glow of spreading fires. Snow had already begun to accumulate on his shoulders and hat, and his breathing came in sharp puffs that crystallized instantly in the frigid air. "Mrs. Whitlow," he called over the howling wind, his voice carrying urgency of a man who understood that minutes could mean the difference between escape and death. "Deputy Collins, Pike's men are using the fire as distraction. They're surrounding the building systematically." Through the driving snow, they could see armed figures moving through Ash River's streets, their red scarves whipping in the wind, as they took up positions that would cut off any escape from the jail. Pike had committed everything to this final assault: his reputation, his fortune, his freedom, and could not afford to let potential witnesses survive to complicate his carefully constructed narrative. Isaac thrust a set of keys into Elise's hands, his own fingers trembling with cold and the adrenaline of committed rebellion. "Back stairs lead to the upper floor," he explained rapidly. "From there you can reach the ore tram platform. It's the only way out now. Pike has men positioned on every road and trail leading from town." But Isaac's gesture of defiance came at a terrible cost. As he turned to leave, a rifle shot cracked through the storm, and he staggered, pressing his hand against his ribs, where blood was already seeping through his heavy coat. The bullet had torn through muscle and possibly punctured a lung, a wound that would prove fatal without immediate medical attention that simply wasn't available in their current circumstances. "Go," he gasped, forcing a small silver cross into Elise's palm, and the same religious medallion his mother had carried through slavery and freedom, a tangible symbol of faith surviving even the darkest circumstances. "Don't let the bastards claim victory." Hakan caught Isaac as he fell, feeling life fade from the older man's eyes as blood pooled in the snow beneath them. Another death to lay at Pike's feet, another price paid by someone whose only crime had been choosing conscience over convenience. But Isaac's sacrifice bought them precious minutes, and in a situation where survival was measured in heartbeats, those minutes represented the difference between capture and freedom. The back stairs were treacherous with accumulated ice each step, a potential fall that could break bones or worse. But they climbed steadily upward through the howling wind, driven by knowledge that Pike's men were closing in below their boots, ringing against iron steps as they swept through the jail in search of their quarry. The ore tram platform jutted out over the gorge like a medieval siege engine, its steel cables disappearing into the white void of the storm, while the wooden structure groaned and swayed under the assault of wind-driven snow. The tram system represented a marvel of frontier engineering. Steel cables stretched across the chasm to carry buckets of ore from remote mining sites to the processing facility in town. But it had never been designed to transport human cargo during a blizzard that could freeze a man solid in minutes. "It's suicide," Miriam observed, looking at the swaying cables that vanished into the storm. Those buckets weren't constructed for people, and in this wind, neither were those cliffs. Hakan replied, already rigging safety lines around Elise's waist, with movements made clumsy by cold and desperation. "But we're still here. The mountain decides who lives." They could hear Pike's men on the stairs below them now, their voices harsh with anticipation and knowledge that their long hunt was finally approaching its conclusion. Boyle's voice carried over the wind, directing his remaining followers to positions that would eliminate any possibility of escape back into the building. There was no choice remaining but to trust in the storm that sought to kill them, and their own desperate courage. Hakan pushed Elise into the first ore bucket as it swayed wildly in the wind, its metal sides already crusted with ice that made every surface treacherous. The cable system groaned under the unexpected human weight, protesting with sounds that suggested imminent mechanical failure. But the engineering held. A moment later, he leapt into a second bucket, and they began their terrifying journey across the abyss. Below them, the gorge yawned like the entrance to hell itself, its depths lost in swirling snow and absolute darkness. Wind caught the buckets and spun them like children's toys, while ice formed continuously on the cables, adding weight that stressed the system beyond its design parameters. Every foot of progress required an act of faith that 19th century engineering would prove adequate to circumstances its builders had never imagined. Behind them, muzzle flashes lit up the storm as Pike's men opened fire from the platform, their bullets whining past through the darkness like deadly hornets. Some struck the cables themselves, sending showers of sparks into the night and causing vibrations that threatened to shake their precarious handholds loose entirely. And somewhere ahead, lost in the white fury of the blizzard, lay whatever sanctuary they might find on the other side of the gorge if the cables held, if the wind didn't tear them from their perches, if Pike's men didn't manage to cut the lines before they reached the far platform. In the howling chaos of wind and snow and gunfire with death waiting both above and below, they rode the storm toward an uncertain dawn, sustained only by the promise that had brought them so far and the desperate hope that justice might yet prove stronger than gold. The cable sang its death song in the wind, vibrating with harmonics that spoke of metal stressed beyond all reasonable limits, as the ore buckets swayed through the storm like pendulums marking time until catastrophic failure. Ice accumulated on every surface with relentless persistence, transforming the simple act of maintaining grip into a battle against the mountain's determination to claim their lives. Hakan's bucket spun wildly as a vicious gust caught it, the rotational force tearing at his wounded arm, until white-hot agony shot through his entire body like lightning made manifest. Blood from his various injuries had frozen to his shirt, creating a grotesque map of their flight across the high country. But the cold also provided numbing mercy that kept him functional when warmth might have left him helpless. Through the driving snow, he could see Elise in the bucket ahead, her cream-colored dress now torn and stained beyond recognition, whipping in the wind like a battle standard raised against the storm itself. She leaned forward with desperate determination, her knuckles white where they gripped the bucket's rim, her hair streaming behind her as she stared toward the far platform that represented their only hope of survival. That was when Pike's men transformed hope into nightmare. Muzzle flashes erupted from the tram station behind them like deadly fireworks, illuminating the storm in stroboscopic bursts that revealed the full scope of their peril. The range was extreme visibility, nearly zero, but trained marksmen with military rifles could still place shots with sufficient accuracy to turn their escape into a running battle. Fought in 3 dimensions above an abyss that promised instant death to anyone unlucky enough to fall. A bullet struck the bucket support directly above Hakan's head, and suddenly his world tilted at an impossible angle as the damaged rigging began its surrender to gravity and physics. His bucket dropped 6 feet in a heart-stopping instant before safety mechanisms engaged, leaving him swaying like a human pendulum over the black void, while the rope connecting him to Elise went taut with strain that threatened to pull her from her precarious perch entirely. The cable's failing, she shouted over the wind, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. Hakan could see it too, the main support line fraying where repeated bullet impacts had weakened the twisted steel individual strands, snapping under combined stress of wind and human weight. The failure was progressive and inevitable, a cascade of mechanical surrender that would send them both plummeting into the gorge within minutes unless he could reach her bucket and redistribute their combined weight across surviving cables. Working with desperate precision of a man who understood that every movement might be his last, he began hauling himself hand over hand up the damaged rigging, his wounded arm screaming protests that he forced himself to ignore through sheer application of will. The safety line connecting them became both lifeline and burden. If he fell, he would drag Elise to her death. But without that connection, they would die separately rather than together. Behind them, one of Pike's men had climbed onto the cable platform to get a better shooting angle, his rifle gleaming in the firelight as he took careful aim at Elise's bucket. The range was still considerable, but a lucky shot could punch through the metal sides and end their flight in a shower of blood and screaming that would be lost in the wind before it reached the ground. Without conscious thought, Hakan swung his legs up and kicked hard at the gunman's bucket as it passed within range, his boots connecting with satisfying impact that sent the shooter tumbling into the darkness below. The man's scream was audible for perhaps 2 seconds before the storm swallowed it completely, but his death bought them precious moments free from accurate rifle fire. The main cable gave way. Just as Hakan reached Elise's bucket, the snapping sound audible even over the wind, as tons of tension were suddenly released in a shower of sparks and flying metal fragments. For an eternal instant, they hung suspended over the abyss by nothing more than auxiliary lines, their combined weight-testing engineering margins that had never been intended to handle such stress. But the system held barely grudgingly with protests that could be felt in their bones, and they swung toward the far platform like human cannonballs fired into the teeth of the storm. The powder magazine squatted on its rocky shelf like a stone toad waiting to explode its thick walls, designed to contain the black powder used in Pike's mining operations, or to channel that explosive force in directions that might serve his final desperate gambit. It should have been their sanctuary after the terrifying crossing their safe harbor in a night that had already pushed them beyond the limits of human endurance. Instead, it became the stage for their final confrontation with the man who had orchestrated so much death and suffering. Pike waited in the magazine's doorway, like the angel of death made corporeal, a lit torch in one hand and a Colt Navy revolver in the other. His expensive clothes, incongruous against rough stone walls and barrels of explosive powder that surrounded him. Behind him, a fuse line ran along the floor like a black snake, its terminus lost in shadows, where 50 pounds of black powder waited to transform the entire shelf into rubble, and anyone standing on it into scattered fragments. "Mrs. Elise Whitlow," Pike said with mock courtesy, his voice cutting through the wind with practiced projection of a man accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "How gracious of you to accept my invitation. And you brought the evidence I trust, along with your companion." Hakan stepped protectively in front of Elise, but Pike's revolver was already trained on them both with steady precision of someone who had killed before, and found the experience less disturbing than expected. The mine owner's face was flushed with fever or excitement, his eyes bright with the manic gleam of a man who had committed himself entirely to a course of action that admitted no retreat or compromise. The ledger pages. Pike continued conversationally, as if they were discussing mining techniques rather than murder and theft. "And whatever other little treasures you discovered during your unauthorized visit to my private safe. Surrender them now, and I might permit you to live long enough to sign certain transfer documents that will make all of this legally tidy." "You mean the same kind of documents you forced Jack to sign before orchestrating his murder?" Elise asked, her voice steady, despite the gun pointed at her heart and the lit fuse that promised death in a more spectacular form. "The ones designed to legitimize theft through forged legal proceedings." Pike's smile was cold as winter starlight, empty of any human warmth or compassion. Jack Whitlow was an obstinate man who chose to die rather than acknowledge that some forces are simply too large for individual conscience to oppose. "I'm hoping you'll demonstrate greater wisdom in your final moments, my dear." That was when Pike touched the torch to the fuse line. Flame raced along the black powder trail like a living thing possessed of malicious intelligence, heading straight for the main charge that would bring down the entire cliff face in an avalanche of stone and explosive force. They had perhaps 30 seconds before the detonation turned them all into bloody fragments scattered across the gorge. 30 seconds to prevent Pike from taking them with him into whatever hell awaited men who had built their fortunes on the bones of the innocent. Hakan lunged forward, but Pike's lieutenant, a scarred gunman named Ketchum, who had earned his reputation in the southwestern mining camps, was waiting for exactly such a move. The man's boot caught Hakan's wounded arm with savage precision, sending him sprawling across the stone floor, while pain exploded through his body in waves that threatened to render him unconscious at the worst possible moment. But Elise moved faster than either man had anticipated her Eastern upbringing, having failed to prepare them for the transformation that months of frontier survival had wrought in her character. While Pike and Ketchum focused on Hakan's threat, She grabbed a hatchet from the magazine's tool rack and brought it down on the fuse line with desperate strength of a woman fighting for her daughter's future as well as her own life. Sparks flew as the blade struck stone, but the immediate threat was severed and the racing flame extinguished mere feet from the main charge that would have ended their story in a single catastrophic instant. Pike's roar of rage was audible even over the storm, a sound that carried all his frustrated ambition and thwarted greed in a wordless expression of fury. But the severed fuse had ignited scattered grains of black powder on the magazine floor, and these smaller fires began spreading to additional powder stores with terrifying rapidity. What followed transcended chaos and entered the realm of pure nightmare, a series of smaller explosions that built upon each other as flames found their way to various powder caches throughout the building. The magazine became an inferno fed by its own destruction, with flames racing across the floor in patterns that followed scattered powder consuming the explosive material, in tiny detonations that grew progressively larger and more dangerous. The roof caught fire almost immediately, sending burning debris cascading down like hellish snow, while smoke filled the air and transformed every breath into an exercise in controlled suffocation. Pike kicked Hakan's wounded leg with vicious intent, driving the Apache scout deeper into the burning magazine, while turning his revolver toward Elise, with murder gleaming in his eyes. But she was already moving, diving behind a stack of powder barrels, as his first shot splintered the wood above her head and sent another shower of black powder cascading across the stone floor. The spilled powder ignited, instantly touched off by sparks from Pike's muzzle flash, creating a chain reaction that turned the entire magazine into a furnace fed by continuous explosions. Each detonation triggered the next building toward the massive blast that would destroy the entire mountainside. Outside the magazine, Hakan grappled with Ketchum on the ice-slick stone shelf, both men sliding toward the cliff edge as they fought for control of a rifle that had been dropped during the initial confusion. The gunman was stronger and uninjured, his muscles unhampered by bullet wounds or exhaustion. But Hakan possessed the desperate strength of a man fighting for more than his own survival, fighting for his brother's memory, for Jack Whitlow's dying wish for the possibility that justice might yet triumph over gold. When Ketchum pulled a knife, intending to end the struggle with a thrust between the ribs, Hakan caught the man's wrist and slowly, inexorably, turned the blade back toward its owner's throat. The effort required every ounce of strength he possessed, every lesson learned during years of surviving in a world that offered no mercy to the weak or unlucky. But gradually, the knife moved until its point pressed against Ketchum's jugular. Inside the burning magazine, Elise used a long-handled shovel to retrieve the duplicate ledger and Pike's bloody signet ring from the flames, blistering her palms on the hot metal, but managing to save the evidence that could still bring down Pike's empire, even if none of them survived the night. The heat was incredible, like standing inside a forge designed by demons. But she wrapped the precious documents in her torn petticoat and held them close to her body. With smoke choking her lungs and flames licking at her skirts, she slammed the magazine door shut, trapping the worst of the fire inside and buying them crucial minutes before the remaining powder exploded and brought down half the mountain. The smaller explosions continued inside the sealed building, each one bringing them closer to the final catastrophic detonation that would reshape the entire landscape. The avalanche began with a sound like the earth itself groaning in mortal agony, a deep rumbling that seemed to emanate from the bones of the mountain as thousands of tons of snow rock and shattered timber began their inexorable slide toward the frozen river below. The series of explosions in the powder magazine had weakened the entire cliff face, and now gravity was claiming its due with the methodical persistence that characterized all natural forces. Hakan and Elise ran down the switchback trail as the mountain came apart behind them, and their feet slipping on ice that had been melted and refrozen by heat from the explosions, while their lungs burning from smoke they had inhaled during their escape from the magazine. Behind them, Pike followed with methodical determination of a man who understood that his own survival now depended on eliminating the only witnesses to his crimes. The mine owner's colt barked repeatedly as he took careful aim at their fleeing forms, each shot echoing off canyon walls like thunder trapped in a bottle. A bullet caught Hakan in the calf, the impact sending him stumbling against the trail's rock wall, while blood began seeping through his torn buckskin leggings. Another shot nicked his shoulder, and suddenly the rope connecting him to Elise went slack as his grip loosened, and she began sliding down the icy slope toward the river that waited below like a black ribbon of death. Working with desperate efficiency, Hakan managed to anchor the rope around a stunted pine tree that had somehow found purchase in the rocky soil, then began hauling back with all his remaining strength. Elise's weight seemed to increase with every foot of rope. He retrieved the physics of the situation working against him as she slid further down the embankment. But he held on with grim determination of a man who had made too many promises to break this one now. The rope burned through his gloves as he pulled the fibers cutting into his palms until his hands were slick with blood. But inch by agonizing inch, he managed to drag her back towards safety. Just as his strength began to fail completely, her fingers found purchase on an outcropping of rock, and together they managed to arrest her slide before she reached the killing cold of the river below. That was when Pike made his final fatal mistake. Confident in his approaching victory, the mine owner stepped onto the frozen surface of the Black Fork River, his boots finding apparently solid purchase on ice that gleamed like black glass in the reflected light of the burning mountain above. His revolver remained trained on Hakan's chest with unwavering precision, the hammer cocked and ready to deliver the killing shot that would end their resistance once and for all. This concludes our business. Pike declared, his voice carrying across the water with authority of a man who had never doubted his own ultimate triumph. You've cost me everything I spent years building: my mine, my town, my carefully constructed future. But I'll still have the satisfaction of watching you die, knowing that all your struggle accomplished absolutely nothing. The ice chose that precise moment to betray him. Pike's expression of confident supremacy transformed into horror as the frozen surface cracked and tilted beneath his feet, plunging him chest-deep into water so cold it could stop a man's heart within seconds. The shock of immersion drove breath from his lungs in a gasp that turned to vapor instantly in the frigid air, while his expensive clothes became waterlogged anchors that dragged him deeper into the river's killing embrace. But the current beneath the ice was swift and merciless, swollen by snowmelt from the explosions above. Before Pike could even cry out for help, the water seized him with irresistible force, dragging him beneath the frozen surface and sweeping him downstream toward whatever justice awaited him in the black depths. Deputy Miriam Collins arrived with 2 townsmen just in time to witness Pike disappearing beneath the ice, his final expression of shock and terror visible for one last instant before the current claimed him. "Good riddance," she said grimly, her words cutting through the wind with the authority of territorial law. The mountain decided his fate, same as it decides for all of us. The avalanche had stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving behind a landscape transformed by violence and natural force that would require years to heal completely. Pike was gone, carried away by the black current that ran swift and merciless beneath the frozen surface. And with him died the corruption that had poisoned Ash River and the surrounding territory for far too long. But they were alive, wounded, exhausted, pushed beyond what any reasonable person might have expected to endure, but undeniably alive. And they still possessed the evidence that would ensure Pike's crimes did not die with him, that justice might yet be served for Jack Whitlow and Nantan and all the others who had fallen victim to one man's insatiable greed. The promise made in a collapsed mine tunnel had been kept paid for in blood and suffering, but honored to the end. And in the growing light of dawn, breaking over the Mogollon Rim, that promise represented something more valuable than all the silver in the territory, proof that decent people could still triumph over evil when they found the courage to stand together against the darkness. The return journey to Ash River passed like a fever dream through country that bore fresh scars of violence and natural catastrophe. The avalanche had reshaped entire hillsides, blocking familiar trails and creating new landmarks from the bones of the old, while burned sections of town sent up columns of smoke that could be seen for miles against the crystal-clear sky that followed the storm. Deputy Miriam Collins took their statements with methodical precision of someone building a case that would need to satisfy the most skeptical judges and territorial officials. Her notebook filled with page after page of testimony, witness accounts, and physical evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of Pike's criminal enterprise and its violent conclusion. Eddie Shaw, his photographic equipment having miraculously survived the chaos of the previous night, documented each piece of evidence with scientific thoroughness. The duplicate ledger with its incriminating work orders, Pike's blood-stained signet ring, the forged marriage documents that had started the entire deadly sequence. His glass plates would provide undeniable proof that the evidence existed and had been recovered under proper legal supervision. The miners heard Boyle bragging about cutting the support beam. Miriam reported as she compiled her investigation. 3 separate witnesses, all willing to testify under oath about what they observed. And there's more. Pike kept detailed records of his bribes and threats, apparently believing he was building insurance against the men he had corrupted. Found them in his private safe after you left it conveniently open. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and damning in its specificity, a paper trail that led directly to Pike and his network of corruption like a map drawn in blood and gold. But for Hakan, sitting in a chair while the town's doctor stitched his latest collection of wounds, the most important piece of evidence remained the bone-handled knife that had belonged to his brother Nantan. The weapon represented more than proof of Pike's guilt. It was a tangible connection to family, to obligations that bound the living to the dead, to promises that gave meaning to survival in a world that often seemed designed to reward the ruthless and punish the decent. Judge Warfield would want to see everything would need comprehensive documentation to build a case against Pike's surviving associates. But the knife was going home where it belonged. Judge Warfield returns from Santa Fe tomorrow, Tuesday, as originally scheduled. Miriam continued, her voice carrying satisfaction of someone who had finally found evidence necessary to challenge corruption at its source. Think you can make it to Fort Wingate in a sleigh? The roads are passable now that the storm has blown itself out. The journey to territorial headquarters took them through country that looked peaceful under its blanket of fresh snow. But Hakan knew appearances were deceptive in the way that characterized most aspects of frontier life. Winter in the high country represented a constant battle against cold exhaustion and the kind of isolation that could break a person's spirit as effectively as any bullet or blade. Elise rode beside him in the sleigh they had borrowed from one of Ash River's surviving merchants, tending his wounds with strips torn from her petticoat, and snow melted over their small fires during rest stops. His fever came and went, like an unreliable tide, sometimes leaving him clear-headed and alert, other times pulling him down into delirium, where past and present blended into confused fragments of memory and dream. During his lucid moments, he told her about Nantan in greater detail, the younger brother who had looked up to him with uncomplicated adoration that only family could provide, who had followed him into the white man's world, believing that hard work and honest dealing would eventually earn the respect that seemed so difficult for their people to obtain. Nantan had died still believing in the possibility of justice, killed by men who understood that Apache lives were simply another resource to be exploited when convenient and discarded when they became inconvenient. He was saving money to get married. Hakan explained, his voice hoarse from fever and smoke he had inhaled in the burning magazine. Girl from our band, pretty as spring water running over clean stones. He wanted to buy her a white woman's dress for the ceremony, something that would make their wedding special in the eyes of both worlds. Elise's hand found his beneath a heavy buffalo robe that covered them both, her fingers warm against his palm, despite sub-zero temperatures that made every breath visible as vapor. What was her name? Morningstar. She still waits for him, I think. Her family told her he died in an accident, but women always know when they're being lied to about the men they love. At Fort Wingate, Judge Warfield examined their evidence with careful attention of a man who had built his career on details that other people overlooked or dismissed as unimportant. He was older than Hakan had expected, with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little. But as he read through Pike's documents and examined the physical evidence, his expression grew progressively darker. "This conspiracy reaches deeper than I initially suspected," the judge said finally, his voice carrying weight of someone who understood that the case before him represented only the visible portion of a much larger problem. Pike had contacts throughout the territorial legislature, possibly extending to Washington itself. This ledger documents payments to men I've known and trusted for 20 years. But the evidence was solid, unshakable, built on documents that Pike himself had created and preserved as insurance against his own criminal associates. The judge granted Elise clear title to the Ash River mine, issued warrants for Boyle and his surviving men, and began the complex process of investigating the broader network of corruption that Pike's death had exposed but not eliminated. For Hakan, Judge Warfield offered a different kind of justice. "This knife," the judge said, holding up Nantan's bone-handled blade with respect due to evidence that had been purchased with blood. "You want it returned for burial purposes. For remembering." Hakan replied, accepting the weapon that represented his brother's life and death in equal measure. "The dead don't need knives, but the living need to remember why they died and what their deaths should teach us about the world we're trying to build." Spring came early to the Mogollon Rim in 1880, melting snow that had held the high country in its grip for what felt like an eternity of cold and struggle. Green shoots pushed through dark earth with irrepressible determination that characterized all forms of life, while the sound of running water filled the air, as streams swollen with snowmelt carved new channels through landscape that bore the scars of winter's violence. For Elise Whitlow, the real spring had arrived months earlier in a courtroom at Fort Wingate, when Judge Warfield had pronounced the words that restored her legal identity and her daughter's future. The Ash River mine was officially hers now, along with all the responsibilities that came with owning one of the richest silver strikes in territorial history. Yet it was a question from the judge during the final legal proceedings that had opened the door to a revelation more shocking than anything Pike's safe had contained. "Mrs. Whitlow," Judge Warfield had asked during their last meeting, "are you absolutely certain that your daughter's adoption was conducted according to proper legal procedures? The documents Pike filed with territorial authorities seem irregular in several respects that warrant investigation." Rose Whitlow was now 2 years old, a child who had been walking and beginning to speak when Pike's influence had separated her from her mother in the aftermath of Jack's murder. The adoption papers bore all appropriate signatures and official seals documenting her placement with the Henderson family near Willow Springs for the child's own protection in a territory that Pike had claimed was no place for a woman to raise a daughter alone. But when Judge Warfield examined the documents with a magnifying glass that revealed details invisible to casual inspection, the deception became clear with the precision that only careful forgery could achieve. "Observe this signature," the judge had pointed out, indicating the relevant section of Elise's alleged authorization. "In every legitimate document you've signed, you form your letters with distinctive characteristics that are absent here. Additionally, the wax seal matches perfectly with the ring recovered from Pike's office, the same ring used to authenticate the forged mining documents." Pike's scheme had been more comprehensive than anyone had imagined, extending beyond simple murder and theft to encompass systematic elimination of potential heirs who might someday challenge his claims. Not only had he killed Jack and stolen the mine, but he had also arranged for Rose's removal to eliminate any possibility that she might inherit her parents' property when she came of age. The reunion took place on a warm afternoon in May at the Henderson Ranch, where Rose had spent the better part of a year learning to walk and talk among strangers who had believed they were providing a home for a genuine orphan. The little girl didn't remember her mother immediately, She had been very young when they were separated. But children possess an instinctive recognition of love that transcends the complications of memory and circumstance. "She's been coughing some," Mrs. Henderson explained apologetically, as Rose clung to Elise's skirts with fierce attachment of a child who had been lost and found again. "Nothing serious," the doctor says, but the spring air seems to bother her chest. He believes it's just something she'll outgrow as she gets stronger. The cough was mild, easily treated with honey and warm milk. But it served as a reminder of how much time had been stolen by Pike's greed, how many precious moments of childhood had been lost to the machinations of a man who saw other people's lives as obstacles to be removed rather than experiences to be treasured. But Rose was alive and healthy, and in the end, that was all that truly mattered. Back in Ash River, the town was transforming itself under new management that emphasized law and prosperity over the fear and corruption that had characterized Pike's reign. Eddie Shaw had used Elise's generous payment to expand his photographic business, becoming the unofficial chronicler of the territory's transition from lawless frontier to civilized community. While his pictures of Pike's crimes had helped expose the network of corruption that reached far beyond a single mining town. Isaac Boone was buried in the town cemetery beneath a simple wooden cross that bore the inscription, "He chose the right side when it mattered most." Elise had established a fund in his memory providing support for the widows and orphans left behind by Pike's systematic elimination of inconvenient witnesses, a practical memorial that would help ensure such tragedies were not repeated. The Isaac Boone Widows Fund. She called it, though she was no longer a widow herself in any meaningful sense. The mine that bore her husband's name had become the foundation for a new kind of community, one built on justice and mutual support, rather than fear and exploitation. Hakan had respectfully declined her offer of a partnership in the mining operation, preferring to maintain his independence as a scout and guide. But he had accepted a different kind of responsibility that seemed more appropriate to his nature and experience. Kneeling beside Rose's small bed one evening, as she recovered from her cough, he had made her a promise that echoed the one he had made to her dying father. "No one will ever hurt you with lies again," he said solemnly, his weathered hand gentle on her small head as she drifted toward sleep. "That's my word to you, little one. And my word is good for as long as I draw breath in this world." The final confrontation with Boyle and his surviving followers had come as an anticlimax after everything that had preceded it. The former foreman, desperate to claim the mine for himself after Pike's death, had returned to Ash River with 5 men using the rebuilt ore tram system to reach the remote mining sites under cover of darkness. But Hakan possessed the kind of wilderness instincts that came from years of reading sign and interpreting the subtle wrongness that preceded human violence. He had heard the cables singing in the wind, with harmonics that didn't belong to an empty system, had noticed the kind of disturbances that marked the passage of men trying to move undetected through familiar territory. Working with Miriam Collins and several miners whose lives had been improved by Pike's death, they had set a trap that caught Boyle's group in the middle of the gorge with nowhere to run and no possibility of escape. A well-placed rifle shot had severed one of the pulley systems, stranding the ore buckets in the center of the cable span, while armed men waited on both sides of the crossing. Faced with the choice between surrender and a fatal plunge into the gorge, Boyle had chosen capitulation, confessing Pike's crimes in exchange for medical treatment of injuries suffered during his desperate leap from the failing cable system. His testimony had provided the final pieces of evidence necessary to close the books on Pike's criminal enterprise permanently. Now sitting on the same stone ledge where they had rested during their desperate flight through the winter wilderness, Elise and Hakan watched the sun set over a landscape that looked essentially unchanged but felt entirely different. The mine below them hummed with honest industry, worked by men who were paid fair wages for dangerous labor, while the town boasted a new sheriff who had been elected by unanimous vote and telegraph lines that carried news of progress rather than threats. Jack believed in your strength long before you discovered it yourself. Hakan said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. He told me you possessed more genuine courage than most men he'd known, including himself. Elise smiled, reaching into her traveling case to withdraw something she had discovered while sorting through Jack's personal effects, a letter addressed to her in his careful handwriting, sealed but never sent. She had found it tucked inside their wedding photograph, hidden where only she would think to look. I found this among his things, she said, breaking the seal with hands that trembled only slightly. Written the night before he died, I think. The letter was brief, written in the hurried script of a man who knew he might not have another chance to say what needed saying. My dearest Elise. It began, if you are reading this, then my fears about Pike have proven justified, and I am no longer there to protect you and Rose. But I am not afraid for you. I have watched you grow stronger with each challenge this country has thrown at us, and I know you have the courage to face whatever comes next. You came to this territory as a banker's daughter from Philadelphia, but you have become something far more valuable, a woman who can survive anything and protect those she loves. Take care of our daughter, and remember that love doesn't end with death. It just changes form. Your devoted husband, Jack. The words were simple, unadorned by legal language or complex strategies, but they carried the weight of absolute faith in her ability to survive and thrive regardless of circumstances. Jack hadn't saved her with hidden documents or legal technicalities. He had saved her by believing in the strength she possessed but hadn't yet learned to trust. They sat together as the mountain darkness gathered around them. Two survivors who had found their way through winter and violence to something that might not have been perfect happiness, but was close enough to satisfy reasonable expectations. The promise had been kept, the dead had been avenged, and the living were free to build something better on the ruins of Pike's empire of greed and murder. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the mountains, carrying the sound of progress and civilization to every corner of the territory. The frontier was changing, becoming something more lawful and predictable. But there would always be a place for people who understood the difference between what was legal and what was right, between what was profitable and what was just. And in the growing starlight of the Mogollon Rim, two figures sat side by side on a stone ledge above the world, alive and whole, and complete, watching over a daughter who would grow up free from the lies and violence that had shaped their own lives. The promise made in a collapsed mine tunnel had been fulfilled, paid for in blood and suffering, but honored to the end. It was more than enough. It was everything.